Can I start by thanking the government of the United Arab Emirates, and in particular the Minister for Happiness and Wellbeing, for this fantastic forum, for the great opportunity it provides for us to swap ideas, to swap experiences, and to discuss how we can make well-being and happiness a core part of government. I should say that the reason why I'm here is because I've been running for the New Zealand Treasury the team that has developed the Living Standards Framework over the last 2 years and developed the work that has come into being New Zealand's wellbeing budget. And you know, I think if we're honest with ourselves, budgets are not the kind of thing which is very exciting and very fun, but I do like to at least have a go at being a bit facetious about the way that we operate, okay? Because the key thing that I want to get across with this cartoon, and that you will find me talking about as we're going through as I'm going through my presentation, is this idea that what's going to matter, what's going to make well-being a part of government is going from what Thomas Edison talks about the 1%, the inspiration part, the grand ideas, and taking that down to the 99%. The bit of the conversation that I think I'm right in saying many of you are part of, the people who work for government, the civil servants, the people who actually do the detailed work, what Edison calls the perspiration, the hard work that makes government work. And for myself, my background actually, perhaps unusually for someone working for Treasury, is working around social welfare and non-government organisations and addressing poverty. And this is very definitely a key part of what we're trying to do. And there's kind of a number of different structures, and again I want to emphasize to you it's all about that part, about taking the work, the great work that's there as an environment, and turn it into something that works at a level that actually works for people within a country, and obviously for New Zealand it's for the people of New Zealand. And the first part, I can't express better than from our own Minister of Finance, Grant Robertson, who, talking at Davos this year, offered this quote here. And the parts that I wanted you to take from this quote, it's not just the general, it's the idea that it's about what is concrete. It's about idea of using evidence. It's about decisions for investment, right? It's about bringing that together, focused on the long-term intergenerational well-being, right? So this is about going from that high level, going from the inspiration down to the perspiration, the things that actually makes a difference for the people within the country. That's the core part of the work that we're doing. And so that's one part, of thinking about, you know, that focus down on what we need to do. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from today, and though I'm going to talk about the wellbeing budget, I'm from the New Zealand Treasury. Treasury's kind of day job is working with budgets, right? I absolutely do not want you to come away thinking that it's just about the budget. It is about change across government. Right? The budget only makes a difference. The budget is only different, is only making big changes when it's part of that wider change. And in fact, the next diagram I'm going to show you actually came out of my visit to this very conference February last year, when I had to think very hard about what I was seeing around me, about these fantastic ideas about there, the great thought, the great evidence that people were generating. And it felt, as somebody who's an official working within government, the hard thing was to try to organise that, try to think about how we will be talking about changing government, of which budgets would only be a small part. And in particular, it's this, and this is the question my colleagues asked me, right? They say it's all very well, you're going away to these international conferences, you're talking to these very clever people, but what do we do? Right? We who work for the New Zealand Ministry of Finance, what do we do for the Treasury, what do we do? Likewise for the colleagues in the Ministry of Education, or for those in all the different parts of government. It's not just about the thought, it's not just about the inspiration, it's about the perspiration, it's about the hard work that people are going to be needing to do. And one of my sort of ways to try and think about this is to think of this as as the Treasury's role within this, essentially is around the task that we do, is around making sure that the financial systems, the bit that we know about, right, is in the right place, is put in place so other people can do their job and use their expertise. And I've put at the very top, the macro level, from your perspective on the far left of this, as very small, because it is actually really very small. The much, much harder task is that meso level, the middle level, and the micro level. So to take one example, it's the people who work, what we can do for around, say, education, is make sure in the budget rules don't get in the way of the people working in the sector who are thinking of converting their great ideas they know about how the sector is run into something that works at the micro level for the people who work actually in the schools. And part of my experience of working with non-government organisations is how often they will tell you that the financial rules are a barrier. People at the centre, people like myself working in Treasury, don't see that because we're not working at that level. So part of our role within that wider system is to make things change. And in particular, in a well-being approach, we have that role. It's a narrow role, but it's an important role. And it's part of thinking about how can we change the way government operates so that the funding is aligned with the great thinking about the sectors, is aligned with the great thinking that is within the organisations. One final thing in here is, though again I'm going to talk about the budget a little bit later, I want you to be clear that in order to think about the system in that kind of way, it's not just about government, even at the centre, it's not just about government process, the budget. It's also about the cabinet committees and the people who do at that central level are thinking about the education sector or the health sector or so. How is it that we're getting the people who are working those areas to work? It's actually also thinking about legislation. Are they legislative barriers or the ways that we operate, the processes that government has that we can change so that they also aren't a barrier and that they also are coordinated with the different elements of what government is trying to do. Yeah? But at the same time, it's the bringing of things together in that sort of way, the coordinating of things in that sort of way that actually enhances the power of what we're trying to do. We're not trying to work against each other, we're working together. Okay, so I was saying something about being concrete about this, being clear about the level we're working. Something else about making sure that government, when it has the information, when it has the good ideas there, that it's structured so that we can use those good ideas to change what we do. And then another part of this, and from my perspective, last 2 years, this has been my day job. So this has been a big deal for me, but I've always tried to be very clear in my mind that this is just one component of making things work. And this is the side of it, our living standards framework, which brings together the different kinds of thinking on well-being and the measures so they can be applied across government. And I'm going to let you into theory. I don't know if the people from the OECD are here. They said they might be or not, right? But I'm going to confess, right? We, in the main, simply stole what the OECD did. Okay, right? I don't feel in the least bit, this is on a few thefts, I don't feel in the least bit guilty about, right? And it's something that, if the other message I was going to give to you was around this, thinking about this as whole of government, the other message is around we need innovation. We need people to think very, very hard. We need people to change what we do, right? That's where the focus needs to be. The reason why we have managed to bring about the changes as we have is we stopped trying to invent our own well-being framework. We took the great work by the OECD and tried to apply it as much as we could to New Zealand. I want to be very clear, there's gaps there, right? And I think people from the OECD will be the first to admit that that those things are there. So in New Zealand, the key issue is around culture. Right, and many aspects, and you'll find within the OECD framing, there's very little discussion of culture, which if you thought about your own well-being and what sense of belonging, how important culture is, that's clearly a gap. I think for myself, when I look at the OECD framework, and I think when I talk to friends, colleagues, that the most natural thing to be talking about when you talk about well-being is family. That's surely one of the things that many, many people will start their conversations about. You won't find anything in the OECD framing about families, right? And there's a kind of gap in there somewhere that needs to be filled, right? So what I'm saying here is that we have a great framework. They've done some fantastic work. They've got expertise in, but there's still gaps. That's okay. We have a great deal of work to do. You'll have seen from the previous diagram when I'm talking about changing where government's operating and thinking about these framings, we haven't completed. We're still on the step forward. In doing the perspiration, it's about doing and learning from doing to take things forward as we're doing this, right? In the New Zealand Treasury, we talk about having a plan for the next 10 years. We don't, if I'm truthful, it's not a particularly well thought out plan after about 2 or 3 years ahead, but we have a plan for that. I think 10 years is extremely optimistic, okay? If those of you who know about the development of national accounting, that started more than 300 years ago. It only really started developing around about the Second World War. It is still evolving, right? The same will be true of well-being thinking. It's not something that in a moment of magic will happen and then be applied. It will be a slow and evolutionary process, okay? So what we did here is we took the OECD framing, we made sure it applied much better to New Zealand. We looked at the data sources, we thought about what we would be doing differently. So then we have our different components, right? We have the thinking about this to make it concrete, to make it part of the way that government operates. We have this thinking about how we're going to be applying it across government and what is needed for that. And then we have this content side, this what is it actually we're talking about when we're talking about well-being. And in particular, I'd like you to, when you look at the diagram that's behind me, the upper part is around current well-being. That's very, very important. But also the part at the bottom, which because we're economists, so we like to talk about capitals, but it's about what matters for the future, what matters intergenerationally. The pattern in the middle is New Zealand called a whariki. It's a weave pattern that's used, and that idea of bringing together the capitals to work together for future well-being is an important part of what we're doing in New Zealand. So we've got those different elements. Then we can talk about the well-being budget, right? And when you have those different elements in there and you're bringing them together through thinking about the budget, a lot of what you're doing here is actually building on some great institutional work that's happened in New Zealand over a very long period of time. So we have been extremely lucky. New Zealand has been a country which kind of takes pride in being quite innovative in the way that we think about government. New Zealand was the first country in the world for universal suffrage that included women in the 1890s. When national accounts were still being developed, New Zealand was one of that handful of countries in the 1930s that brought in national accounts. Great reforms in the 1980s encouraged this sort of transparency. So in that sense, the fact that we're bringing things, that we're part of this sort of front of the well-being is just a kind of natural progression for New Zealand's work in terms of trying to be at the forefront of changing government. I think with well-being, and I noticed when Jacques Attali was talking about the countries that have relatively high well-being, when you see those graphs that graph income against well-being, New Zealand is always an outlier. New Zealand has always been a country where people like myself, who originates from Britain, come from relatively wealthy countries and go to a poorer country, a financially poorer country, because the well-being, the living standards in New Zealand are so high. It's a sort of good place to live, yes? And I think that is one of the reasons why for New Zealand well-being feels right. It feels something that we need to do to understand what it is about New Zealand. Now, in terms of the budget, what we've tried to do is to integrate the different bits of thinking I've talked to so that it's incorporated into all the elements of the budget. So in New Zealand, the budget's essentially in 3 parts. It's in a very strategic part where we talk about the high-level things we want to achieve, and you'll notice in the slide behind me that that's on the bottom half of that slide. So it's priorities like sustainability, like supporting Maria Pacifica, and children and so on, okay? And that's something which we have fed directly into. As we were developing the Living Standards Framework, we brought that information into structuring how we thought about the priorities. again, it's about the perspiration side, the detailed side of what we're doing. The next side is that we have a cost-benefit analysis for everybody who puts in a bid. So everybody who says they want money and new money in the budget has to go through a cost-benefit analysis, which is structured around that slide there, structured around the different elements that are part of it. So it's not just the priorities, it's also when people are trying to justify why there should be extra money in the new budget, that's also structured around well-being. And the work that has gone into changing the cost-benefit analysis so that it incorporates those wider set of outcomes. And then the final part of the discussion is about bringing these things together. So it's very much the ministerial part of the process. But it's not just those kind of more technical elements as well-being. It's also the framing of what we're doing. It's also the story we're telling about what we're trying to achieve is very much focused on well-being. Okay, so that's the kind of core, and it's very much building on a platform of what we've already before. So with the great transparency reforms in New Zealand in the 1980s have enabled what we've got here. And just to finally finish off, I just want to give you a little bit of a better sense, a bit slightly less abstract sense of the kind of work, what that means, right? Now these diagrams that I'm going to show you look a bit complicated, and part of the reason they look a bit complicated is one of the things we want to put at the very center of what we're doing here is distribution. We're not going to talk about averages, because averages hide as much as they tell us, right? We want to talk about what's different, what's diverse, but in a way that allows us to think about the work we're doing. This is a complicated diagram, but it's actually a very simple idea. The bigger the yellow bit, the worse things are. The bigger the blue bit, the better things are, right? So the Pacific Island population of New Zealand is people from places like Samoa, Tonga, and so on. And the Maori population is indigenous population. They're both, the reason why they're a priority is they're both populations which have suffered long-term disadvantage. What we're doing here, though, is trying to explore that a bit more, trying to understand a bit more about that. First and foremost, I don't know if this is in touch, but one of the things that people who are in populations that are disadvantaged get very angry about is the entire conversation is about how they are disadvantaged and bad things are happening. People get very angry with that, and that's fair, right? And you can see that here. It's not that people in the disadvantaged populations never have any good things happen to them. It's just that it's less likely, and it's a crucial part for what we need to say. But the second thing is here, even if we're thinking about the policy to address where there is disadvantage, it's not, disadvantage isn't some unitary thing. We go, tick, that person is disadvantaged, right? It's a wide range of factors that are in people's lives, and it's bringing that together. It's that idea of the shape. And what we can do is drill down to understand those different elements. So in this case, what is key is there is economic disadvantage for both groups, but it is far more important for the Pacific Island communities. In the Pacific Island communities, other elements of well-being are relatively strong. For Maori, it is across the board, and actually it's not so much around the economic, it is much more around the inclusivity, about the development, subjective well-being and so on. So that it's thinking about that distribution, thinking and understanding that it is not just about, people aren't just income bearers, they aren't just healthy or unhealthy. There's a totality of a person there, and it is about thinking across those elements that actually gives us a sense of where policy needs to operate. Okay, so I want to thank you very much for this opportunity. Very happy indeed to talk about the work that we've been doing in New Zealand. Thank you.